Can I just start with a sound check? Can you guys at the back hear me okay? Brilliant. All right, thank you very much indeed. So, first of all, it's an absolute honour to come and speak to an august audience like yourselves. A lot of the people I speak to don't have Royal in front of their names, so this is an absolute delight for me. The previous slide, this is how I got into doing this lectures. I am a host on an aviation podcast by an American captain for an airline we'll call Acme. And he's been running it for many years now, and I'm just the sort of British Airbus military representative. But if you do have an interest, then please look us up, airlinepilotguide.com. And Neville here, who's my cameraman tonight, he also is on a podcast more associated with the UK, Plain Talking UK. So if you are a podcast listener, there's a couple you might want to jot down. So my talk tonight really is about policing the skies during the Cold War. I was initially brought into this by Matt Lee, who asked me to go and lecture at the RAF Museum Cosford, the Cold War Museum, which I thought was a great venue for my first go at this. But here we are, and I got collared to come and do this down here, and I'm delighted to be here. Now, like some of you, I was born not long after the war ended. I guess you'd call us baby boomers, really, wouldn't you? I was unable to find a way into civil flying, particularly after then spending every spare moment I had with the Air Cadets. It seemed that the Royal Air Force was going to be my only way I could get into aviation. It was hard that time. Hamble had closed. There were a lot of civil airline pilots without jobs, but the Air Force was always looking for some lad at the age of 19 and a half, straight out of school, no university degree, to go and become a pilot. And I jumped at the chance. Now, my flying training was pretty standard. It started off on the Jet Provost Mark III, moving on to the Mark V, at Linton-on-Ouse, which is where all the less smart lads went to. I wasn't a Cranwell cadet. I didn't do my officer training in the Grand College there. I went to Henlow, which was a bit more down to earth, and on to Linton. But with my new wings on my chest at the end of that course, I moved on to fast jet training at RAF Valley. Now, we of course wanted to get into our green flying suits, which we did pretty quickly, but I wasn't dressed in that flying suit for long before I was back in number ones, and we were attending a funeral. So I was there in my formal number one uniform with my hands crossed over a sword inverted, the point of the sword on the cold flagstones of a little Welsh chapel. And the coffin behind us held one of our fellow students. It was 1976. And for the Air Force, it wasn't a good year, but it wasn't a bad year either. The year had started with the loss of a Scout helicopter from 662 Squadron. He was flying at night near Crossmaglen in Northern Ireland. After the pilot became disorientated, the aircraft crashed and it killed both him and his crew member. Now, the same month, a Wessex helicopter crashed and sank into the Atlantic. Two Harrier fighters collided in mid-air during a target run, and both Harrier pilots were killed. February, a Jaguar, a Jet Provost, and a Red Arrows Gnat were lost. March saw the loss of another 4 aircraft. Happily, only one pilot was killed, a Harrier pilot. He ejected, but sadly outside the capability of his seat to save his life. April, not a good month. 5 aircraft destroyed. One was an Argosy transport. They were doing a practice 2-engine approach, and when they put on power to go around, the aircraft turned on its back and killed them both. Another 2 were Gnat trainers. They collided in mid-air and killed all 4 crew members. May wasn't too bad, helped correct the balance a little bit. They only lost 2 aircraft. One was a Hawker Hunter. Pilot got disorientated in cloud, and when he came out of cloud he was too close to the ground to recover and he crashed. June was pretty much back to normal, another 4 losses, although there were no deaths. 2 pilots were critically injured. Now, July, August and September, I'm moving this on a bit because this becomes a bit of a list, I'm afraid, counted for 15 separate losses and 12 deaths. Jaguar pilot flew into the ground. He was doing a bomb toss maneuver, and instead of putting out his combat flaps, his slats, he put out the speed brakes by accident and never recovered. A Hunter pilot was lost at sea. He lost control. Another Jaguar pilot just disappeared on a transit back from Denmark where he'd been on exercise. In Belize, a Puma helicopter crashed following an engine failure over a forest and killed all 8 on board. Now I'm going to leave October for a second, move on to November and December, which were fairly quiet months. 2 aircraft failing to make it home. Now October saw the death of my friend and fellow student, Ashley. He was only on his 3rd flight on a NAT when he was flying a circuit at a local diversion, and one of them on board mishandled the aircraft during the finals turn. The NAT was susceptible to a type of stall they call a swept wing stall, but it was hard to diagnose. We all knew about it because it was a threat. They didn't diagnose it quickly enough. The aircraft impacted the ground about half a mile short of the runway at a very high rate of descent. Now in 1976, the RAF lost 43 aircraft and 27 personnel. No particular trend. It was a variety of handling mistakes, aircraft faults, weather problems, foreign object damage and the like. Nothing that stands out. Military flying carries a risk. In those days the risk was high, but it was the price we all paid for doing the job. As a youngster, it never even occurred to me that it would ever be me. We treated such events with black humour that you're probably familiar with. We used to write on the soles of our flying boots, "Dig here." As a student at Valley, moving on to something more light-hearted, this was my flying instructor. I had a poster of him on my wall just for fun. I had my fair share of interesting, using air quotes there, flying instructors. Ray Pilley was on something of a punishment tour. He'd tried to get airborne in a Phantom out of Germany, and he'd left his wings unlocked. If the Phantom can fold its wings, well, they just changed the locking system from one that was operated inside the cockpit to one that was operated by the engineers from a wheel well. The 2 little lugs that indicated the wings were unlocked had been overpainted by accident using the same camouflage paint as they had on the wings. He got to about 100 feet, which was pretty impressive, dancing on his reheats before he decided it was best to step overboard. The aircraft crashed and fireballed only a few hundred meters from where they were holding nuclear QRA. Now my basic flying instructor was a lovely chap called Mike. He had flown Gannets on exchange with the Navy. Now his little mistake, which got him into flying instruction, was to taxi clear of the runway at Lossiemouth, and when he reached in to raise the flaps he pulled up the gear instead. Now the interlock is supposed to prevent the gear from coming up when you're on the ground, but obviously the interlock wasn't playing that day, and as he sank onto his little radome there, it was an AEW aircraft, his prop started beating a tattoo on the concrete. He realised there was something of a problem. Now at the Phantom OCU I was taught by a chap called Roy Lawrence. Just looking to see if that name rings any bell. You've probably heard of a Phantom that one day shot down a Jaguar in Germany using live missiles that it was flying on an exercise with. The Jaguar pilot survived, but Roy ended up back at the OCU. What can I say? Flying the Gnat was a challenge. It was a lovely airplane. It was fast and nimble, had a roll rate that watered the eyes. But once we got up to speed, it was fun for our students. I felt sorry for the instructors. They always had a very poor view from the back seat. Now, I'm trying not to dwell on this. We're here to talk about a different subject. But at our graduation, we set light to the mess piano. It was fairly traditional in those days. In fact, it had happened so often, the president of the mess committee was determined not to lose another piano. He banned it. For our graduation, a couple of nights before, we had snuck in and exchanged the mess piano for one that we found in a junk shop. Hidden the mess piano, and then we dragged it out in the replacement, making a great fuss, threw it onto the grass and set light to it. The PMC was absolutely furious. He ordered the fire trucks from the station to come along and be there with their big water cannons. And when they said, "What do we do, sir? Should we put out the fire?" He said, "No, hose those students." Anyway, he was very annoyed, but once he realised that his precious mess piano was still intact, there wasn't much he could do. By the way, take a note of the chap in the top photograph on the very right-hand side, one of my great friends who was to become the Chief of the Air Staff and is now a Knight of the Realm, Sir Glenn Torpey. So on our way then to tactical weapons, where we were going to learn to throw things at the ground, I was on 63 Squadron, commanded by the inimitable Hoof Proudfoot. Lovely chap, won an AFC for getting a Harrier back at night with a total electrics failure. Not an easy job. Sadly, he was killed flying a Lockheed P-38 at Duxford in 1996. Now on the Hunter, it was coming towards the end of its life. They were amazing airplanes and one of the loves of my life. I was so pleased to get the chance to fly with them. Almost every cockpit was different. The switches appeared that someone had thrown them at the instrument panel at random, and every aircraft was different. And the legend that told you what they did was written by some marvellous old chap with a white very thin paintbrush. He wrote on what they did, and of course they very soon, those little scribbles flaked off, and we didn't really know what most of the switches did. We had a sort of a theory that if we moved the shiny ones, that was fine. We left the dusty ones alone. Now the Hunter has a great history, if I may take you back a little bit from this time to the House of Commons. And I quote from Hansard here, when Mr. Stokes asked the Secretary of State for Air, "Will he now make a statement on the loss of 6 Hunter aircraft which crashed in Norfolk on Wednesday the 8th of February 1956. Stop me if you've heard this one. The Secretary of State for Air, Mr. Nigel Birch, replied, "A court of inquiry has reported and shown that the accident was not due to aircraft failure." Yeah, 6 aircraft in one day. In fact, within a period of 10 minutes, the Air Force managed to throw away 6 Hunters. It was an interesting little day. Take our minds back to RAF West Raynham and the Central Fighter Establishment, where all decent fighter pilots went to learn to become experts at their trade. On this morning, 8 pilots from the Day Fighter Leader Squadron, very impressive bunch, got airborne. They briefed and planned, and the weather ship took off and said, oh, the bad weather they were expecting wasn't nearly as bad as they thought, so they launched. Strict instructions to get back in the overhead of West Raynham by 11:15 at 20,000 feet, which they duly did. But the Met officer said, it's going to be quite bad weather, and lo and behold, at 11:15, and the weather at West Raynham had clamped. Sadly, the radar, ground-controlled approach radar, was not working that day, but it was at their number 1 diversion, which was Marham, a mere 15 miles down the road. So quite sensibly, they sent all 8 aircraft off to Marham to go land there. As they arrived at Marham, the weather, which was sliding in that direction, had sort of beaten them to it. They arrived in a big gaggle to be told that there were only instrument approaches available. Now, the radar controller had the unenviable job of separating all 8 aircraft into individual returns so that he might spin them around and point them at the GCA to land. He got the first 2 on the ground, but the remaining 6, not quite so good. They had about 10 minutes of fuel left. Okay, the first two made it in, but Whiskey Tango 629 was the first one. He got down to 600 feet, didn't see anything, tried to go around, but the engine flamed out, short of fuel, and he ejected, crashing into a field 2 miles northwest of Swaffham. Remember that name. Whiskey Tango 639 did exactly the same. Whiskey 633, almost identical, but his aircraft impacted a mile away from the first two wreckages. Whiskey 639 got down to 250 feet, still in cloud, climbed up, ejected. He landed, or his aircraft landed 3 miles to the south of Swaffham. Now Whiskey 603, he was very low when he had his engine flame out, and he probably decided that his old Mark II ejector seat, well, it would have been new in those days, wasn't perhaps trustworthy at that height, so he tried to belly land the aircraft. He got away with it, but sadly the next bloke to try exactly the same trick died in the crash. Now sadly there's no report of how the people of Swaffham felt when 6 aircraft rained down around them in 10 minutes. So despite the long line of aeroplanes that we had at Brawdy where I did my training, they were old and often unserviceable. We would often go out with trying to get 4 aircraft airborne for a formation, and one of us would go US. I remember one particular day we tried 3 times. 3 times we manned the aircraft, 3 times someone broke. We had to go in, reassemble, come out, 4 different airplanes, and off we go. And climbing out the last time, the leader said, "That's it, you know, we'll go back and have a cup of coffee and try this tomorrow." And we noticed one of our number was sprinting for the hut where we kept the Form 700s that we signed the aircraft out and signed them back in again. It's where the engineers really took over. He ran for the hut to scribble his name under the aircraft, and we wondered what was going on till we turned around and his hunter was gently trundling down the pan, because he'd been in and out of it so many times he'd forgotten to check the chocks were in the last time he got out. The airplane trundled down the pan and went across the grass straight towards the senior engineering officer's office. Luckily it stopped and sank into the grass just before it got to him. I wonder what he thought as it nosed up to his window. So duly competent at throwing bombs at the ground and not missing the ground, firing rockets at a very big dartboard and firing those wonderful 30mm Aden cannons at air and ground targets, I moved on. My next thing to do was to convert to the aircraft I'd been posted to. In my case, I was very lucky. I went to the 228 OCU, the Phantom OCU, at RAF Coningsby. I was delighted to be flying the Phantom. It was a monster of an aeroplane, 20 tons, fire-breathing, death-dealing terror, and all the things that a young man can think up. First time I stood beside the aircraft and gazed up at the cockpit, I really was quite amazed. I never dreamed I'd be flying an aircraft with this amount of power, those huge intakes, that fantastic crank on the wings, the lovely anhedral on the tailplane. It was just superb. I was both thrilled and intimidated, probably in equal amounts. The cockpit contained an imposing display of iron instruments, switches, levers, all seeming a little too big. Don't forget they were designed for American knuckleheads. I was forever smacking my elbows on the sharp corners. The navigators had a very similar setup. Their view, as you can see, was extremely limited. In addition to all the knobs and fancy things he used to play with, primarily for controlling the air intercept radar, he had panels upon panels of circuit breakers down by his feet. The only thing he could use to move those circuit breakers was a special little tool fabricated by the Royal Air Force that, if you've ever eaten snails, it was something like a snail fork. Now the aircraft was built around, at that time, one of the world's best air intercept radars. It was those who are interested, the Westinghouse AN/AWG 11 or 12, depending on which version you were flying. It employed pulsed Doppler as a mode, as well as the more conventional pulsed radar. Now, of course, pulsed Doppler measures a change in frequency from the returning radar blip so that you can pull out a target against the great big return that the Earth is. Normally when you point a pulse radar down at the Earth, all you get is the massive return that the planet will give you. But pulse Doppler, because it doesn't look for that return, it looks not for the time base, but the change in frequency, you could separate that return out. And it allowed us to very effectively attack low-level targets. The weapons we employed at that time were the AIM-9 Papa, stern aspect heat-seeking sidewinder missile, the AIM-7E2, Sparrow 3 semi-active radar-guided missile, and slung in a pod on the centerline, we carried the 20mm M61A1 Vulcan cannon. It was a 6-barreled Gatling gun firing 6,000 rounds a minute. Yep, 100 rounds a second of 20mm high explosive. Very impressive. Under the wings, we usually flew with 2 Sergeant Fletcher fuel tanks. If necessary, we could strap an even bigger centerline tank on as well. Now, there was a lot to learn on the OCU and time was short. We learned the basics of intercepts and combat, and we learned some of the Phantom's foibles. Angle of attack, measure of the relative airflow against the chord line of the wing, used to give an indication of the stalling angle and where we were in relation to it. Well, there was a very specific limit in the Phantom of 21 units. And if it were exceeded and things didn't go well, the aircraft could depart in a heartbeat. If it did so, it would often end up in an unrecoverable flat spin. And the Air Force didn't like losing its aircraft to manhandled, mishandled, useless pilots who put their airplanes into the flat spin. So there was a definite limit. The trick was, as you approach that limit, to use the rudders instead of ailerons. Now, that's a difficult thing to relearn if you're a young pilot. So when the aircraft buffets, use your boots was the word. So when you're in combat and you were turning the airplane very hard and you wanted to roll, you either had to relax and roll in the conventional self, or you held the turn going and just use your rudders and using the secondary effect of rudder to roll the airplane. Not an easy trick to learn. Course complete, and we were posted to our squadrons. I was sent to North Scotland, which I thought at the time would be a pretty boring place to go, considering there were many more exciting squadrons in RAF Germany. I joined one of the most famous Battle of Britain squadrons, one that was first formed in the shadow of Stirling Castle with 1.5 strutters in 1916, number 43 Squadron, the Fighting Cocks. My first flight was with the Squadron QFI, Mr. Phantom himself, we called him, the amazing John Abel. Downwind on my night dual check, there was a big bang from the left side of the airplane as the supersonic intake ramp cycled itself and surged the engine. We looked in and saw that the left engine temperature was rapidly increasing over 900 degrees centigrade. John suggested I shut down the engine, and he said, why don't we make this a single engine circuit to land. This particular aircraft, the one I was lucky enough to get my name on as a very junior officer, was X-Ray Victor 582. Those of you interested may know that it has been rescued, and although it's in the colours of a different squadron, Treble 1 Squadron, and now known as Black Mike, hopefully it will end up in a museum one day. The calibre of pilots I had to work with and learn from was incredible. I'm here posing in front of George Lee's Phantom. Apart from being a fine fighter pilot, He was thrice World Open Gliding Champion, awarded the MBE, the Royal Aero Club Gold Medal, the Britannia Trophy and the Lilienthal Gliding Medal. I also saw him achieve a maximum possible score at Edinburgh Gunnery, which was some feat, I tell you. Our training never ceased, and to become operational on the squadron I had to learn several new arts, one of which of course was airway refueling. We progressed rapidly through increasingly difficult operational tasks, mainly intercepts, but they culminated in the Phase 3 vis-ident. That's when you come in on a target you can't see, it's got its lights out, and obviously it'll be at night time, and your navigator talks you in using the radar until you get to a point so close you can visually see the aircraft at night without night vision goggles, which was something of a task. You hope for a bit of a moon, or if not, you hope there was enough starlight out so that you could see perhaps the profile of the aircraft against the stars, but that was the trick. You had to stabilize in a visual formation to pass your Phase 3 vis-ident check. When at last combat ready, we got our coveted 43 Squadron badge and we're allowed to wear it on our uniforms, on our flying suits. And more important for everyone else, we were then allowed to do QRA. Quick Reaction Alert was a major commitment for the squadrons up there at Lucas. 24/7, every day of the year, we had 2 fully armed Phantoms sitting on 10 minutes readiness. We slept in our flying gear, our immersion suits, and my personal record from a no-notice scramble to getting airborne was 7 minutes. I was asleep in the bed, on a bed at the time when the hooter went. But usually if trouble was rearing its ugly head, we'd be brought to cockpit readiness, from which we were supposed to be able to get airborne in less than 5 minutes. Now, the Cold War was a big part of our lives. It dominated our tactical thinking, almost to the exclusion of everything else. The Soviets had a massive arsenal and had already demonstrated their ability to build unimaginably large weapons. Now, back when I was 7, Premier Nikita Khrushchev had demonstrated the Soviets' ability to create a weapon of indescribable power. I don't know if you've heard of it, the Tsar Bomba. At the equivalent of 50 million tons of TNT, the bomb had been dialed back from its full potential of twice that, 100 megatons. And the scientists really did that almost without permission. They were terrified that a weapon of that power might irrevocably damage the atmosphere, and certainly the aircraft that dropped it would have no chance of surviving. The brave pilot who did drop it, even at its dialed back power, was Major Andrei Donovstev, and he commanded a specially modified Tu-95 Bear to deliver this 27-ton bomb. His aircraft painted pure white to help reflect the heat. At 11:32, he passed over the drop zone at 34,000 feet and he released the weapon. It deployed a parachute, which gave him 3 minutes to escape. He pushed his throttles full up and hoped for the best. Then the bomb exploded. The 5-mile wide fireball reached as high into the sky as the Bear was flying, and the shock wave caused him to lose control of his aircraft and he started to lose height. The blast broke windows more than 500 miles away. Witnesses saw the flash through the heavy overcast 600 miles away. The mushroom cloud boiled up to 45 miles above ground zero. The cap had a width of nearly 60 miles. All the buildings in the village of Sverny, located 34 miles from the drop point, were completely razed to the ground, and buildings hundreds of miles away lost windows and doors. The heat would have given a person third-degree burns 62 miles away. Window panes were broken, all over the place, including Norway and Finland. The seismic shock wave travelled around the world 3 times, registering 5.25 on the Richter scale, and this was an airburst, not a ground burst. Surprisingly, it was quite clean. Being an airburst, it didn't pull anything up from the surface of the Earth to irradiate, and there was very little residual effect. Old Denevstov finally regained control of his bear, but when he got down and looked at it, the whole of his belly was charred black. The aircraft's belly, not his. Now, has Khrushchev's wish for a 100 megaton bomb been fulfilled, Major Denevstov would have been dead, and we all wonder what would have happened. Now, not every QRA launch ended up in an intercept. Some were practice, no-notice scrambles just to test the system. And the ultimate fun was to be scrambled off down to Wales, to Cardigan Bay, to fire one of your weapons. It was where the Strike Command missile establishment was. And we used to go there in our aircraft merely to prove that, 1, we could find Cardigan Bay, 2, the radar worked and could lock onto the target, and 3, when we fired the missile worked. Now, my first live intercept was a few days after my 24th birthday. It was on the 13th of December 1978, and I had about 500 hours total experience. I wasn't even operational. I was actually flying in support of a large NATO fleet exercise called Exercise Northern Wedding. Our American fighter controller vectored us off our cap to move out and intercept some visitors from the east. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I had a very experienced navigator in the back seat, Tony Bound, who said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." Descending onto the fleet were a pair of Tupolev Tu-95 Bears. Now, the first was a Bear Bravo, which could carry the huge Kangaroo air-to-surface nuclear missile. In the recess, you can see just marked out on the belly there. When it was in place, that's what the Kangaroo looked like. Pretty big thing. It could have been an airplane in its own right, really. The broad chin radar housed Crown Drum, the missile guidance system. And now trailing it was a photo reconnaissance version, a converted Bear Alpha, called in those days the Bear Echo. Now, formatting on them was an experience I'll never forget. They had 4, I'm going to read this, I hope you don't mind, NK-12M turboprops, each producing 14,800 shaft horsepower, powering contra-rotating props, 2 on each engine, with a diameter of 5.6 meters, that's over 12 feet. And when they were cruising, and particularly when they put on high power, the tips of those props went supersonic, and the noise for us formatting on them was incredible. We could feel the vibrations coming through the aircraft, and we could hear the thrum of those enormous propellers. I remember gawping at the size of it. It really was quite fantastic. It had a very rough finish, rivets poking through, sharp edges, few holes, ports, pipes, blisters, radomes, all sorts of things. Naked silver aluminium and that bright red star. We escorted the pair right through the fleet, an overhead USS Forrestal at 1,000 feet. Now, normally we weren't allowed within a million miles of the aircraft carriers that the Americans had, but because we were escorting the Bears, that gave us free rein. Forrestal wasn't launching at the time, so being the only fighter cover, we were the only guys to track these Bears around as they wove through this vast NATO fleet at will. The tanker support we had kept us refueled, and when we got back home, that would have been my longest sortie to date at 6 hours 55 minutes with no piddle pack. Bladder control aside, once fully qualified, live intercepts came thick and fast. These are just little excerpts from my logbook. 3 Bear Foxtrot, 1 Bear Delta, Bear Foxtrot, Bear Delta, 4 Bear Foxtrots, Bear Bravo, Bear Charlie, 2 Bear Deltas, 2 Bear Deltas, and 3 Canadian frigates. 2 bare deltas, 2 deltas, 2 foxtrots, left engine failure, divert to lossy mouth. What's that one? 2 bare deltas, bare delta, badger delta, bit more interesting. Oh, and a coot alpha. We policed a fairly large chunk of airspace, covered around 4 million square miles. We covered northern France. We're talking the red line here. The blue lines were the coverage of our main radar units. Went almost up to Iceland. That was our area of responsibility, but we didn't restrict ourselves to it. At times we went well outside. In some respects, we weren't very well equipped for the task. At Lucas, we flew the Phantom FG-1. It was an ex-Navy Phantom, but when the Navy decided it didn't want the aircraft carriers anymore, I jest, they would love to have had some more aircraft carriers, but that's what the government said. We had some interesting times. The Navy Phantom had no inertial navigation system. At that time, they hadn't worked out how to align an INAS on board a moving vessel, so that was out. For some reason only known to the Navy, it had no HF long-range radio. So when we were on QRA, once we were outside 100 miles or so from our units, we couldn't speak to anybody. If we had a tanker on board, we might relay a message through them, but that was, hit and miss. So generally speaking, we were working without any supervision, any command or control. And that, I have to say, flying a fully armed aircraft during the Cold War as a 24-year-old was an interesting job. A scramble was usually preceded by a SITREP, a situation report from Buchan, our sector operations centre near Aberdeen. Came over a secure line with information on bogies inbound and expected time to be brought to cockpit readiness. That was our cue to dash out and have a pee, finish climbing into our immersion suits. Ground crew would fire up the hoochin and get power onto the aircraft. The aircraft had no batteries, for heaven's sake. I don't know what the problem that was on being on board a ship, but whatever. If the tracks continued, Buchan would formally bring Q1 and Q2 to cockpit readiness. We used to thump a big red button. That was fun. A siren would sound in various places around the station. Clangers would also sound as the doors automatically rolled back. We would run to our aircraft, being careful not to be trampled by our ground crew, who always insisted on getting there first. Once strapped in, we now had a live feed to the sector operations centre through the aircraft telebrief. And that was on a landline, so there was no chance of the Russians intercepting that. SITREPs continued, perhaps advising us that a tanker had been launched. It always took those blokes a while to get airborne. I think they had a hard job getting them out of the aircrew feeder. Eventually we would be ordered off. Lucas Alert 1 Phantom, it was always very formal. Operations would come back with our call sign and they would say, Mission 57, Vector 030, Climb Angels 25, call Buchan Fighter Stud 63, scramble, 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 acknowledge. By that time I usually had both engines going. Navigator would be scribbling down the instructions, as limited as they were. And as soon as the engineers showed me all the missile safety keys to show they'd removed them from the missiles and everything was live and ready to go, ground power pulled everything up. We'd bang the canopies down, taxi out. We always had priority. There was a very short taxi to the end of the runway. We'd get everyone with a headwind or tailwind, didn't matter to us. And we'd be straight off. There was always a bit of a lull after we got airborne, and we'd have a quick look round, make sure we got all the ejector seat pins out correctly and everything looked right. Navigator would check his radar and make sure that was working, and then they'd stand Q2 down so they could go and have a cup of tea. They were always desperate for us to come back and say we were unserviceable so they could nab the intercept instead. And then we'd often hear that a Shackleton was going to get airborne out of Lossiemouth. Now the old Shack managed to, shake its 10,000 rivets in close formation off the runway, and they'd struggle off. I don't know what speed they flew at, but we'd frequently complete the mission, come back with all the intel, and go past them, and they were still motoring out to their nominated camp. We'd say, well, we've done it all now. The bears have turned north, and we're heading home. And we'd say, why don't you, turn around and go back? And they'd say, oh, we've got all these rations to eat. More than likely, we'd get launched and we'd meet up with the tanker. Sometimes, if we were lucky, it would come up and join us. More than often, Q1 would get airborne, do the intercept, and the tanker in Q2 would come up and relieve them a little later on. That tanker would be ours to have for the whole mission, and we'd be able to suck it dry, and they'd often give us navigational assistance, remembering we had no inertial navigation system. Once we're out of range of the TACAM beacons, they unlocked. The only thing we could use to check our position was to use the radar, basically. There was a kind of a Mickey Mouse navigation thing that the navigators used to try and play with, manual winds, all that kind of stuff, and they'd often tell me I was near the equator. We'd be handed off from Buchan to Saxe-Savoord as we headed north, and then if we were intercepting near Iceland, we'd often speak to the Faroe Islands. Now the Faroes were interesting. They weren't actually part of NATO at the time. They couldn't give us vectors, but they were very helpful and would give us lots of navigational information. When we got within 100 miles or so of our bears, we stood a chance of making contact. My nav would run the intercept. It'd give me the number of targets, their disport, etc. And then once we got close, we'd conduct our 10-mile safety checks. Now, despite being a young 24-year-old, I wasn't keen on starting World War III, so we always went to great pains to make sure that our missile load was going to be safe whilst we messed about with these Russians. The radar would go to standby. We weren't interested in giving any additional electronic intelligence to the Russians. Closing up on the targets, I felt usually a measure of relief and enormous excitement, tempered, of course, depending on how my bladder was doing at the time. Relief, really, that we had made the intercept successfully, and the excitement was that we were actually going to look at our enemy in the eye. Now, the first job was to get the door number. We had a fascination with door numbers. That was something of a task, easy during the day, but not so easy at night. I would formate underneath the bear, in between those enormous propellers, and with the anti-collision light just behind the cockpit, we would move up the fuselage, and the navigator would try and read the number from the light of the blinking anti-coal light. If he couldn't see it, then I would tap the burners and light the whole sky up with 15 feet of flame, usually resulting in me popping out the front and him watching this train of an aircraft go underneath and try and grab the door numbers as we went by. What the Russians thought, I have absolutely no idea. Eventually we got first generation night vision telescope, which was about a foot long, and it wasn't a big cockpit. I felt very sorry for the navigators. They had to kind of bend double to get it up and point, and every time the bear's anti-collision light went off, it used to bloom and take so long to settle back down again, bloom. It would just be an impossible task. Now, sometimes I would formate underneath as close as I dared. We needed to get pictures of what the bear had, what kit it had, so that our intelligence guys could use it, and also so that they could practice their dentology. Now, the Russians used to mess around with us. They would change the door numbers of their aircraft, and the only way to get an accurate count was to actually check parts of the airframe for scratches and dents which they couldn't erase, and compare them with the door number to see if they changed the door number and thereby get an accurate count. Now, I have to laugh nowadays at the fuss our side sometimes make about being intercepted. Too close for comfort. Dramatic moments of an unsafe Russian fighter jet scrambled to intercept a US flying over the Baltic Sea. How do they think we got photographs like this? Now, my nav here was convinced he'd found a new aerial on top of this poor chap. And the only way I could get it was to do that Top Gun thing and fly inverted over the top of this bear. I said I'd only do it once. Luckily it worked. Now, once we'd identified the aircraft and got the door numbers, we were usually instructed to shadow or to watch them to PLE, our prudent limit of endurance. That became a rather long and tedious job, I'm sorry to say, because our charges were often moving right through our airspace and it would take hours for them to get from one end to the other and we'd be sitting with them. My nav would have fun snapping away with his little fancy Nikon, sadly not a Canon. What were they thinking? And I would look for crew members of the Soviet aircraft to wave at. The reaction depended really, I think, on who they had on board. Sometimes they would be very friendly. They'd wave back. They might hold up a mug of what I assumed was tea, was probably vodka, and mouth "Nazdrovy" at us. Sometimes they would stare straight ahead and they wouldn't interact at all. And we always thought that those aircraft might have a political commissaire on board who was keeping an eye on them. They would take photos of us while we took photos of them. If you can see the enormous camera that that chap in the blister had, we used to love playing games with him. As he brought this camera up and started twiddling with it to try and take a picture, we'd slide underneath and pop up on the other side. And he would have the difficult job of clambering over several feet of pipes and stringers and bits and bobs until he got to the other window, whereupon we'd slide under and do the off. So we could keep going for that for hours. Of course, occasionally we'd be lucky and watch them do something more operational. A descent in the middle of the ocean often heralded something operational for them, and we would close up in close formation and follow them down through the clouds. I've shown the wingtip here. As often as not, we'd formate in the tail because it was either, when they put bank on, their wings moved quite fast. They weren't really interested in giving us a smooth ride, and you had to move the airplane fast to get out of the way. And they weren't always happy having us around. Particularly at night, they were renowned for firing flares at an escorting fighter or shining their bright signaling lights directly at the cockpit. I almost fell foul of one sneaky trick. This bear pilot who I was following down in a spiral as he descended down, bearing in mind we weren't sure of our altitude above the ocean. We had a radar, but it didn't usually click in till a couple of thousand feet, so we were relying on a pressure altimeter, and we had no real idea of what the local QNH was. I was in the inside of his turn, and as he spiraled down, unbeknown to me, he'd started slowing his aircraft up. Of course, in a fighter, straight off the tanker, 8 missiles, 3 big tanks, I was pretty heavy. And the first thing I realized that I was getting dangerously slow was when the pedal shaker, the angle of attack warning on our left rudder pedal, started rattling, and I realized that we were getting very close to the stall. Really not sure of how high I was. I unloaded the airplane, leveled the wings, and slid underneath him, lighting the burners to get some speed back, and at that point the radio altimeter low warning altitude warning went off. And with the amber lights on and navigator screaming at me, we pitched up and climbed away. We circled on round and found the guy on radar and closed up on him again, so he didn't achieve much, but he certainly scared my poor nav. Sometimes, as we descended, we might find ourselves in a naval fleet. I remember at one time we were around 30 degrees west across the Atlantic, closer to Greenland than we were to Scotland, and as we came out of the cloud there were 3 Canadian frigates. And the Bears had obviously decided that this was going to be their target for the day, and we had fun playing with them. Now, Dave from our sister squadron across the airfield, there were 2 squadrons at Lucas, 43 and Treble 1. We call them the girls' school, Tremblers, or just 3 flight. But once when Dave from 3 flight had been formating on a bear, it started dropping sonar buoys. And he thought, oh, this would be interesting. I'll get a photograph up inside the bomb bay of the sonar buoy dispenser. The Russians obviously thought this was going to be fun, so they dropped a sonar buoy on him. It bounced off his fuselage and hooked up on his rudder. And Dave went, oh, look, I've got a prize. He's got this sonar buoy hanging off his fin. So he thought, oh, the intel guys would be really interested in this. I mean, we didn't find out for years afterwards that our submarines were sneaking around and picking up the sonar buoys, so they had plenty. But he thought he'd drag this sonar buoy all the way back to Lucas. He only got it halfway home before the nylon cords of the drogue wore through and it disappeared. He was very sad, but he had a dent on the airplane to prove it. Now, Tremblers had a bit of a reputation. One Friday afternoon, we always traditionally had ground training, and we would be sitting in a classroom, no one would be flying, and if an aircraft got airborne, it was going to be a Q launch. And lo and behold, Tremblers were holding Q and they roared off. Now, we didn't know what had happened, but these boys had gone up and they intercepted some bears at low level between Iceland and Scotland. And they were told to remain to PLE, and down at low level, they thought they knew where they were, but they decided that they were going to pull up and go to Iceland and refuel. Now, when they eventually got to quite a low fuel state, pulled up, the navigator turned his radar on and pointed it towards Iceland, and there was nothing there. Someone had stolen Iceland. So they went, oh, well, we must be close to Scotland. So they spun around and pointed it to Scotland. Nothing. This might be a problem. They found an AWACS, remarkable airplane. And he gave them a squawk, and he gave them their position. And they worked out that they would either flame out near Iceland or flame out near Scotland. They chose Scotland because closer to home and the water was warmer. They jettisoned 3 tanks, empty of course, and 8 missiles, worth an awful lot of money, into the sea, climbed to height and started cruising home. Now, very luckily, a VC-10 of the Operational Conversion Unit, the Tanker Conversion Unit, happened to be bumbling around Scotland, and although they were a training crew, they were diverted off to go find this Phantom, which they did. And Mac McGregor, I shouldn't have said that, had so little fuel, he didn't really think he could complete the intercept, so the VC-10 very kindly turned and rolled out right in front of him, and he managed to plug and get enough gas to get him back to Lucas. We were all sitting in ground training when we heard, emergency state 2, emergency state 2, Phantom 10 miles finals, and we went, that's QRA. Ground training stopped, we all went to the windows, and in landed this Phantom with a completely clean wing. And we went, I thought that was, God, wasn't that cute? Shortly followed by our boss coming roaring upstairs going, all right, you lot, what's the lowest fuel you would pull up from low level on a Q mission? And we all came up with our sort of rule of thumb, this amount, and plus a bit for mum. And he went, oh, thank the Lord for that. Anyway, some missions lasted many hours, and another Q-bird would be launched to relieve us so that we could relieve ourselves. So it was uncommon, but this is one of the few chances we got to photograph each other when we were formating. And Ian Dugmore, who I think is probably still the chairman of CHIRP, the organisation that takes confidential pilot reports, was flying beside me, and he took that picture of me very nicely. But it gave us the chance of a selfie. But this was probably the most amusing selfie. we did our bit of the ocean, but there was an American unit up there at Iceland, the Black Knights, and they were intercepting the same bear as us on this day, along with 2 US Marine F-4s who were visiting. And these American Marine pilots, you know, weekend pilots, thought this was so exciting. They intercepted an absolute Russian. This was going to be fantastic. They came on to our very discreet control frequency, which we used to the absolute minimum so that people wouldn't actually work out what frequencies we were using. And they came up on it and started bleating away, asking for us to take their photographs and giving us their home addresses. Now, not every aircraft we saw was a bear. This was a very rare and elusive coot, an IL-20 Mike Coot Alpha. It sported all sorts of interesting bits and bobs. They were a dedicated or electromagnetic intelligence gatherer. So an ELINT aircraft. They could often see us coming. Our side were particularly interested in that canoe, which held their sideways looking radar. We also saw the bison. The bison and the bear looked similar, but the bison is a big animal. A badger. Bison and the badger. Bison is a big animal, badger's a little animal. Bison needs 4 engines, badger only needs 2. So they're bisons and badgers, and they had a very wacky edible refueling system. We couldn't work out how the devil they made that work. We're occasionally launched for the very new backfire and sometimes blinders, but sadly they didn't really have the range to get to our play area and very, very rarely came past Norway. Now, my time on 43 ended, and I ended up as a qualified flying instructor at Valley. And I then was lucky enough to become a qualified weapons instructor on the Phantom, which led me to a tour down under, flying a lovely aeroplane, the F-18. I was amazed then how long in the tooth the F-18 was, but for the Australians and for me it was brand new, straight off the factory floor, and that was fantastic. After 3 years of fun in the sun, I was posted back to the old base I was used to, RAF Lucas, but this time on the girls' school. So I ended up as a flight commander flying F-3 Tornadoes for Treble 1. We still held QRA, but this time we had hardened aircraft shelters. Things had progressed, but we very rarely got scrambled because the world had changed. Aircraft I read about in top secret manuals with a few grainy photographs that had been smuggled across from the east at great risk. They were now sitting on our flight line. I was even crawling over the cockpits. Aircraft that I might have excitedly intercepted were parked outside our damn squadron. Of course, things aren't really quite that simple. With increasing numbers of Russian incursions into our airspace, a new Cold War seems to be starting. But personally, I've done my bit. I'm going to leave that to the youngsters. Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I lose my voice, forgive me. I found that fascinating. I don't know if you guys did. And I'd like to lead into the questions, if I may.
Of course, although I suspect your question is going to be too difficult.
Because I'm ex-Air Force. I was out in Segenthalb in Germany. And towards the end of my time there, the radar people said, there's something big, go and intercept it. We never saw what it was, but it was the beginning of the bears in 1955.
Oh, really?
I believe. Yes.
Wow.
They first flew in 52. and they were still experimenting with them, and they were going up and down the German NATO border in Germany. So it was quite fascinating. The other thing that intrigued me, I see you were born in Pembrey. Was that right?
Yes, in Kent. Pembrey.
Oh, that, a different
Pembrey.
Pembrey.
Not Pembrey, the old firing range, no. No, that would have been a considerably, very exciting birth.
I thought that was maybe where you got your interest in aviation from, but obviously not.
No, that really came from my father, an ex-World War II Sunderland pilot, who, still going, and a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He flew airliners up till he retired at 60.
When you went on, I found it fascinating. This is a personal point of view, forgive me. I was at Valley for quite a while. I did my jet conversion at Valley. I often wonder if my room was the room that Prince William had afterwards. Maybe not, I don't know.
No, neither do I. Did you call the mess Alcatraz like we used to? That's what it always looked like. It was dreary looking building in front of a lake, and the very lake where we burnt that piano beside.
Yes.
But yeah.
And when you led on with the Air Force, I thought, my God, that's a different Air Force than I was in.
And now it's a completely different Air Force than we were both in, yeah.
And the number of people that you lost was mind-boggling.
And that wasn't a particularly bad year. It just happened to be the year that Ashley died, which is why I picked it. But I could have picked a much worse year.
Yes.
Some of our pilots used to meet all the other officers usually at a staff college, and they would have perhaps a syndicate of 20 officers, administrators, engineers, and pilots, navigators. And there was always a little bit of friction because pilots and navigators received an extra element of pay called flying pay, and they used to rather annoy the ground staff, the ground-based officers. And the usual reply was, well, if you let us line 25 of you guys up against the wall each year and shoot you, we'll let you have flying pay too.
Another place you mentioned was Cardigan Bay, the weapons training unit there. When I was flying vampires, just got onto the valley. I was over that area, and then in my radio went bang, 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 and a Spitfire whistled past me. I thought, my God.
Wow.
So I had a dummy fight with a Spitfire from a vampire. But even those days, the Spitfire was infinitely more manoeuvrable than the vampire was, although I could climb and leave him standing. Anyway, gentlemen, that's my comments. Excellent. Any more questions? Any questions, anybody, please?
Please don't be shy. Yes.
What do you think is the single greatest contribution to the increase in safety in military aviation?
The single greatest contribution to the increase in military aviation, I think the lack of aeroplanes. No, I'm only kidding. When I came from the Phantom Force to the Australians on the Hornet and then came back to the Tornado, there was a distinct difference in the attitude of both the Air Forces and the pilots. The pilots drank a lot less. That probably was one factor. There was everything was a lot more serious. People took things really very carefully. The aircraft were worth considerably more. I don't know what a Phantom cost back in the day, but certainly by the time I finished flying with them, it wasn't worth very much. But we were getting Tornadoes and Typhoons, and the whole ethos of the military had changed. So the mechanics were more sophisticated. The mechanics of the aircraft were more sophisticated. The capability of the aircraft were much greater, and I don't think we were taking nearly as many risks.
You're obviously describing flying Phantom FG1. Did the squadron ever get mixed with the FGR2, or were they always out in Germany, I guess?
So was our squadron never equipped with FGR2s? No, but I did fly the FGR2 because the Operational Conversion Unit had FGR2s. And when I finished up at Lucas, I did my weapons instructors course on the FGR2, so we flew them both. The FGR2 was a slightly better airplane in the fact that its equipment was better. Having that HF radio was a big thing. But the inertial navigation system, even though it had one, was pretty basic. It was an entirely mechanical inertial. And the navigators used to physically program it rather than doing it electronically. They actually had a knob that was connected to a piece of wire that went in and moved cogs. And when they wanted to put in a lat and long, they would unlock a pot. They had, I think, 9 pots. And they would use a little joystick to move a counter, mechanical counter, that would whir and move cogs inside the inertial. And then when they got to the position they want, they put this pot back in and lock it off, and that would physically lock that position as a mechanical position within the inertial. The thing was about the size of a suitcase as well. It had a few errors, but at least they had some idea. But no, the FGR-2 was a great airplane. Yes, sir?
The Skyflash missile, did you use that and when did that come in? Was it successful?
Did I use the Skyflash and when did it come in? Exactly when it came in, I'm not sure. But I was lucky enough to fire one of the initial trials when we moved from Sparrow to Skyflash. We were up in northwest of Scotland in a range that was vast and activated especially. The target was dropped by a Canberra called a Stiletto. It was a Mach 2, 60,000 foot target that was kind of jet-powered glider, had a fairly large radar area so we could find it. We would set off. They cheated and told us when to accelerate and basically where to point. We would then fly quite a complicated acceleration maneuver to get up to around 50,000 feet doing 1.2 to then try and fire at this Stiletto. So we had a closing speed of well over Mach 3 total. The contact was coming down the scope so fast, some of the navigators physically couldn't keep it in position, get their lock markers over it to lock up the missile, but we managed to. I do remember we had special recorders fitted to our intercom so that we could give a commentary. Anyway, we got locked up. It went firing, now whoosh, and this telegraph pole came off from underneath the airplane. The noise was like an express train. It was incredible because it's like only about 10 feet away when the motor ignites and it goes off. And it went scooting up towards this target, which I couldn't see, but I knew was up there. And sadly, the telemetry of the missile failed. They got no data from it. So the only information they could get about what the missile behavior was from our commentary. And all they got from the commentary was me going, "Whoa, look at that! That's fantastic!" So they weren't best pleased.
Any more questions?
Yes, sir.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Americans had a different engine to the British one, did they?
Yes, they did. Yes, the Americans had different engines to our Phantoms. That's a story in its own right. They had J79s, the original design. The Labour government, when eventually they finished cancelling TSR2 and the F-111, decided that they needed a large British component for this Phantom they were going to buy from the Americans. So they insisted on putting Rolls-Royce engines in it. They chose the Spey, an airliner engine, which had lots of problems, particularly when they tried to marry a reheat to the back of it. It frequently used to blow the engine out, and we'd get sheets of flame coming out of the intake instead of out of the back end as the engine surged. The reheat time had to be lowered to a very slow reheat, 5 seconds to get the reheats fully lit. And in addition, the engine was much fatter than the J79, so that lovely Coke bottle effect that the aircraft had, area rule, that gave it a good supersonic speed, was destroyed by the tubby fuselage we had to create. And the intakes had to be much bigger to cope with that extra requirement for air, which at high supersonic speeds caused intake damming, effectively turned the intakes into air brakes. So we were never as fast supersonic as the American aircraft, even though we had considerably more thrust out of the Speys. And the main reason really was, the reason we liked it was because the Speys had a good specific fuel consumption. So when we were tootling along at low level, we could go a bit further. And quite honestly, high supersonic speeds are great if you want to go for a world record. But they weren't much practical use in real combat unless you wanted to give your missile a really big start as it reached out and touched someone at 60 odd miles.
At the back there, Red.
What aircraft do you wish that you could have flown?
I'd love to go the F-22. That looks fantastic. The F-35 looks great, but our version with this fan at the front there, that huge great big bonnet, and that's just going to be dead weight, isn't it? Once you're tootling along and you're no longer requiring to hover, and having built a big carrier, then stick a damn catapult on it, and let's have the cheaper and lighter, and you could use that space for a fuel or all sorts of good stuff. So I always thought that was a mistake. So I think I'd love to have a go with it, but just to fly the Eurofighter would have been great. I know, the next generation of pilots moved on to that, and it's a stunning airplane. Having flown the F-3, which I have to tell you was a dog, it was an awful fighter. It may have been a great ground attack airplane, but it had nasty little wings and completely manual wing sweep. The engines weren't nearly powerful enough. It was heavy. On QRA missions, we used to, on the Phantom, be up there formatting at 37,000 with a full missile load and 3 tanks. In the Tornado, you'd be lucky to get above 28,000. In fact, they halved the missile load for QRA's missions for the Tornado, purely because it could have a standard chance of getting up to the Bears. And instead of being able to formate on them at high level, the guys used to do a high-speed pass, get enough energy to zoom up to their height, and fly past them with a navigator with his camera on motorway, trying to get some pictures.
Another question up there.
When did the Phantoms replace the Lightnings?
Well, they really overlapped. The Lightning squadrons were still in force whilst the Phantom was in, but there are probably some lovers here of the Lightning. I had no time for it. It was a pretty useless airplane. I had so little fuel. If you put 20 minutes of fuel in a Phantom, it would probably work even better than a Lightning. So it had very limited range, had very limited weapons. Of course, a lot of that was because not enough money was invested into improvements, but you could never get that radar stuck in the middle of an intake up to a size that would accommodate a decent antenna. So it was always going to be an airplane designed for like point defense, immediate reaction, get up, shoot down a bomber, come back, and hope for the best. The Phantom really was an aircraft much better suited to intercepts. It was a much more capable machine. But apart from that, we used to call the Lightning pilots wee-walls because they often came to the Phantom and all they could say was, "When I was on Lightnings," wee-wall, when I was on Lightning. Okay.
Any more questions? There we go, at the back.
I'd like your thoughts on the F-104 then.
I'm sorry, the first part of your question?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Oh, well, the only aircraft we could outturn, I'm not kidding, we could outturn lots of things. The Harrier we could outturn in the Phantom, etc. The 104 we could definitely beat in a turning fight. But they didn't hang around for turning fights. In the same way in the Tornado, when we met F-16s, F-15s, we didn't try and turn with them. We couldn't. We had about half the turn rate of an F-18. Half. 16 degrees a second, vice 32 degrees a second instantaneous turn rate. When we met the 104s, those boys said they couldn't engage us initially. They would just blow straight through. And their great tactic was to sneak around using fighter controllers and come down on us at enormous speed from behind. And when they're pointing at you, they're very hard to see. So yeah, great. But it was an interesting airplane for the Luftwaffe to get, with their ex-World War II pilots. And their first jet airplane was that machine. Wow, that was the one that killed so many of them. Sorry, there was a...
You said there were normally 2 aircraft on QRA, and the second one would probably go off fairly soon after you'd gone. Was there a second line of QRA? Did they automatically bring up a Q3
Yeah,
and 4?
exactly what we would do. So the question is, what happened when Q1 and Q2 got launched? As soon as there was a requirement, the squadron who was holding Q would generate Q3, Q4, and I've been up to Q5 and Q6 on a very busy day. So yeah, we just start generating. The engineers used to hate it, particularly when it was on a weekend. They used to have to come in and start putting missiles on aircraft and getting them all going. But yeah, we'd call crews in. I shouldn't tell this. I was in the bar at Kinloss. We'd been deployed up there because our runway was being resurfaced. And we were, in theory, holding Q. But we had all gone to the bar. The two Q crews were, over on the dispersal with their aircraft. And we just hi-hoed into the bar on our knees, pretending to be the Seven Dwarfs. You ever done that? And we used to annoy the Nimrod guys. Anyway, we were well into our ales, and the boss came roaring in and said, "It's nightmare up there. We need a Q3 crew." And we all looked at each other, and Al Lockwood, later become OC5 Squadron and Station Commander Coningsby, said, "Well, I've only had 2 beers, boss." So off went Al, and I think the amazing JP Smith went off with him to go and man Q3. So yeah, we used to generate, just keep generating airplanes till we ran out.
Any more questions, folks? Gentleman at the back again.
Well, you went to Australia through the F-18. How did that feel compared to the F-4? Did it feel like it was kind of a relatively step on? Or?
How did the F-18 compare to the F-4? It was like chalk and cheese. I mean, seriously, an absolute step up in generation. The F-18 was small, nimble, made of a great deal of carbon composites. The cockpit was ergonomic, a word that hadn't existed when the Phantom was designed. 3 TV tabs, a moving map on the center one, HOTAS. The throttle alone had 22 different functions on the switches on the throttle alone. The stick was very similar. If you went away on 2 weeks leave, you used to have to go back in the simulator just to try and relearn what all the switches did. It was an incredible airplane. It was nimble. It was very, very fast, particularly indicated airspeed. Mach number wasn't enormous. It could climb to great altitude. For the Australians, perhaps a little bit short of legs. It didn't quite have the range. Australia is a damn big country. The F-15 might have suited them better, but they wanted a multi-role aircraft. And the Australians used it in every role possible. I did just about every job you can do in a fighter, from close air support to interdiction to battlefield air interdiction to interception to high value asset to ship attacks, the whole 9 yards. And we did everything with it, and it was an incredibly capable aircraft. The radar was just stunning with its 3 modes as opposed to the normal pulsed, Doppler and pulse. It had a medium PRF mode that would track a target through any aspect. I didn't cover it, but the main problem with a pulse Doppler radar is if your target is cunning enough and turns exactly at 90 degrees to you, he will be flying relative to you at the same speed as the ground, and he will disappear off the radar display. The JAG boys used to call it kneecapping. They would fly a kneecap, fly along a little while till they thought we'd lost him, then they'd turn and try and progress. Medium PRF, it didn't do that. It was just superb. And it had other little tricks up its sleeve, like non-cooperative target recognition, which I can't talk about or I'd have to shoot you.
Any more, folks?
As a commercial
There we go.
pilot, do you ever fly near Ireland, and have you ever seen any UFOs?
Well, 25 years, and I guess any object you see in there that you don't know what it is by definition a UFO. But I'm pretty certain that British Airways saw some meteors. You see those quite often. One of our pilots once was surprised by an amazingly close rocket launch that went up past him, and he wasn't sure what the hell that was. But no, I've never seen anything that I would not put down to some sort of natural weather phenomena, or perhaps something entering the atmosphere. There are an awful lot of bits of metal as well as chunks of rock up there trying to get in, and I'm pretty sure that was it. But you do get to see some great things, the Northern Lights regularly, and beautiful sunsets and things. But that's about all you can say about civil flying. 25 years now, and I am ready to retire. So.
Just continuing on that note, what about this explosion with drones with capability?
That's very interesting, and I certainly think there is a good place for drones in the front line. And the question was, what about the development of drones and its use in the military? They are undoubtedly cheaper and safer for our pilots. And you think about the cost of throwing a photo reconnaissance aircraft out into enemy territory. Well, you could probably buy, I don't know, I'm guessing 5 drones, and you might lose 2. You lose 1 fighter, and that's going to be a considerable cost, let alone the cost of the crew. Yes, sir?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain myself well enough, but I was referring to the explosion of drones which aren't military, which
Oh, the civvy ones.
yeah.
Bloody nuisance. We know that they will penetrate the cockpit of a helicopter or a light aircraft very easily. We know that with sufficient velocity they'll come through the front end of one of the airliners I fly. So we are worried about them. One goes down engine, you'll probably lose that engine. When you've only got 2 of them, that's not funny. And I'm very glad that they recently found and prosecuted a drone pilot who had disobeyed several rules. He'd let his drone fly out of visual range of himself, and he flew it to an area where he knew there was a police helicopter operating, purely, presumably, to film the incident. And that is irresponsible to the nth degree, and I think we will probably support that. Don't get me wrong, I have 2 drones and I really enjoy using them. I think they're fantastic. I'm into my photography, and that's a great way of getting your camera up into the air. But there's an app I have on my phone which gnats will give you for nothing. That will tell you exactly whether it's safe in your area to fly your drone and to what height. Not that you can go above 400 feet anyway. Those rules are up there to be followed, and I would be very disappointed if anyone who really knew the consequences of flying their drone in front of an aircraft would have, if anyone actually did that purposely. It would be dreadful.
There he is again, 3rd time.
What do you think the nicest aircraft is at the moment?
The nicest, the A340, I think, the 600. This is one of the aircraft I currently fly, because it's got a coffee maker. It has a toilet, and it has usually 13 very attractive cabin crew, the boys included. They're also very attractive, to help the hours to while away. If you've got to fly an airliner, find one with 4 engines. ETOPS has its place, but that's not in my heart. That's not where that place is. Flying over a big ocean with only 2 engines, for me, is just asking for trouble. I think we both agree that if we could find an aircraft with 5 engines, we'd like to fly that. No, the A340-600's got those beautiful big Trents. It carries a considerable number of passengers, comfortable to fly, easy to fly, lovely to land in a crosswind, and I put it down in a 47-knot crosswind at Shanghai in the middle of a typhoon. And I tell you, although the first go frightened us all, the second go worked reasonably well. Although the engineer did go out and ask and look at the number 1 engine, he watched us land, and he wanted to see if I'd left any grass sticking out of the bottom.
Is that it, folks? Okay. Sorry, isn't another
Nick.
question.
Oh.
We're talking about the reheats on the... I was test flying at Rolls-Royce, and I did a lot of the test flying for the Lightning reheats.
Oh, really?
So adjusting the nozzle, because I've had the 2 extremes of that. One, when the nozzle's too close, lost 15 foot of reheat. The other time, when the nozzle's too far apart, they won't light. And you said the flames going forward. Fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, forgive me if I make a mistake. Didn't the Lightning engines, when you put them into reheat, they used to latch there? And you had to lift latches to pull them out of reheat?
No,
I'm only thinking of Taffy Holden, the engineer who got airborne in it.
Lightning reheats was on the Canberra.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Different sort of kettle.
You all heard about Taffy Holden, the engineer that got airborne in lightning, yeah, because he accidentally got him into reheat, and when he was doing a taxi test, and he couldn't get the latches worked to pull it out of reheat to stop, and he thought the only thing he could do now was to get airborne with all the pins in the seat, so he couldn't eject, no radio, no headset even. And it took him about 5 or 6 goes to land, and he was so traumatized at the end of it, he went back to hospital many times, trying to get over the drama of it. But he managed it, he got it back on the ground. Just shows what an easy airplane it was to fly.
Well, thanks a lot, Nick. You've made my aviation experience, I feel as I was back in the Stone Age.
Oh, forgive me, you were.
I did 4 years in the Air Force, and I was 22 when I came out of the Air Force.
Wow.
But were you still at school, presumably?
I don't think I was born.
Anyway, I think we should thank Nick in the normal way, because as far as I was concerned, that was fascinating. Looking at your faces around there, you're all thoroughly enjoying it. Thanks ever so much.
You're very kind.